Hey folks, today I'm going to be talking about StarCraft II from the lens of an Age of Empires player. I'll be talking about game design, mechanics, community, the competitive scene, and everything in between. The idea for this video came from one of my favorite books, The Chrysanthemum and the Sword. If you haven't read it, it's a book about Japanese culture written for the American military during World War II. Aside from just being an interesting read, I like this book because it explicitly identifies aspects of American culture that we don't necessarily consciously think about, but believe in anyway. It's kind of like the last thing the fish knows about is the water. If something is ubiquitous in your environment, it's easy not to be consciously aware of it because it's always been there. My goal in this video is to talk about StarCraft through the lens of an Age of Empires player, through the lens of someone deeply familiar with RTS games, but relatively new to the world of StarCraft. I think by doing this, we can understand both sides a little bit better. It forces us to explicitly think about why things are the way they are, instead of simply accepting it because it's always been that way. To use a simple example to illustrate things, do you think StarCraft would be a better or worse game if the maps were procedurally generated rather than fixed? In other words, everything from base placement to resource availability to paths across the map were procedurally generated. My guess is your answer would be no, but I would also guess that you've never really considered what a competitive RTS game looks like with procedurally generated maps. StarCraft, and Warcraft III for that matter, has always had fixed maps, so there's never been any reason to ask this question. For Age of Empires players, however, a substantial perspective shift is required to enter the world of StarCraft. Deep knowledge of static maps is suddenly much more important than being able to think on your feet and adapt to whatever the procedural generator has thrown at you. I'll talk about this more later, but I just wanted to introduce this example to give you an idea of what I'll be talking about. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce myself so you know where I'm coming from. I've been playing RTS games since Age of Empires 1 and started playing online in Age of Empires 2. I played competitive 1v1 in both Age of Titans and Age of Empires 3. I started playing StarCraft with the launch of Legacy of the Void and reached Masters League within a few months. I'm currently sitting comfortably at High Silver, Low Grandmaster. I don't have experience with Brood War, so anytime I say StarCraft, you can safely assume I mean StarCraft II. In addition, while I've played every game in the Age of Empires series, I only started playing competitively in Age of Mythology. That gives a bit more weight to the later entries in the series than the average Age player would probably expect, just a heads up. I want to first talk about the high-level philosophical differences in the design of these two series, and the way in which these differences seep into the nuts and bolts of virtually every game mechanic. The first and most important difference is the target audience. Age of Empires traditionally targeted a broad consumer base. In a 2003 interview, Bruce Shelley, one of the key game designers on the series, said that the commercial success of the games was due in large part to their appeal to both casual and hardcore gamers. Blizzard, in contrast, has consistently emphasized its focus on esports and the fact that careers are on the line when changes are made in StarCraft II. The target audience of a game is interesting to think about due to its omnipresence. You can examine any aspect of a game through this lens and understand it a bit better. A good place to start is the foundational tool from which much of these games is built, the map editor. Right off the bat, you'll notice that Age of Empires features an in-engine editor. A link to the editor was consistently displayed prominently, either directly on the title screen or at the top of a major menu. As a result, every player is encouraged to check it out and create their own maps. Pay particular attention to the scenario nomenclature that's used, indicating that its primary function is the creation of campaigns or arcade-type custom games rather than competitive maps. In fact, an entire book was written to help casual users build the scenarios of their dreams. The StarCraft II editor is one of the most intimidating pieces of software I've ever interacted with. Its user interface looks like it was designed in 1995, and I had to do a Google search just to figure out how to launch it. Diving into the usability of these editors is also revealing. Age of Empires is intuitive and easy to use. Help text is consistently provided, and the nomenclature carefully thought through to be as clear as possible. Notice how triggers are a first-class menu item whose user interface explicitly calls out conditions and effects, making it obvious what its function is. StarCraft hides triggers underneath a nebulous modules menu and exposes dozens of obscure features like viewing raw data that are likely useless to the average user. Just look at these two programs side by side and tell me which one is more accessible and easy to use. The difference in feature sets illuminates the contrasting design philosophies between these games. While Age of Empires is consistently intuitive, it's also highly inefficient. Keyboard shortcuts are hidden if they're available at all. Terrain placement is clunky and imprecise, antithetical to the creation of finely tuned competitive maps. The StarCraft editor is more like the Adobe Premiere of map editors. Intimidating, sure, hard to use, sure, but incredibly powerful once you know how to use it. Decoupling the editor from the in-game engine permitted the developers to assume the full resources of the machine were available, allowing the copious use of search boxes and a customizable user interface. Testing maps requires a full launch of the game, implying that complicated triggers for custom scenarios that require lots of in-engine testing weren't the focal point. The average user won't have much luck with the StarCraft editor, but power users can leverage its extensive feature set to efficiently produce polished, world-class competitive maps. The takeaway is that the philosophical difference in target audience ends up impacting everything, even the developer tools. Especially the developer tools, really, since that's what the developers use to build much of the game. This naturally extends into the way these games are built and sold. Twice as many Age of Empires expansions and new titles were released in half the time of StarCraft's total lifetime, averaging close to one a year. In order to keep customers interested across releases, Ensemble Studios, the creators of the series, adopted a transformative approach to game design, in stark contrast with Blizzard's more iterative take. Blizzard's approach is epitomized by their approach to balance, making the smallest change possible with the biggest impact. This lends itself naturally to a devoted core audience. If you like the game, you'll probably continue to like it. New updates won't rock the boat too much. This is paired with continuous free updates that meticulously fine-tune the game as problems are discovered. Professional players, who, as David Kim once emphasized, have careers on the line, don't have much to fear with regard to a balance patch suddenly changing everything, especially since Blizzard proactively collaborates with them to design future updates. Age of Empires took the opposite approach, preferring to experiment and transformatively change gameplay to keep players interested. Between the release of Age of Empires II in 1999 and Age of Empires III in 2005, Ensemble changed. The core macro mechanics through the addition and removal of auto-queue and allowing multiple units to be queued on top of each other, the resources available to players and how they were gathered, the ELO and ranking systems which were eliminated in Age of Empires III, the available races, units, and buildings, the way supply is allocated, added and removed god powers and titans, and finally, added a leveling mechanic in which playing a race more gave you better stuff. And yes, this did apply to competitive 1v1. This isn't an exhaustive list, it's merely a sample of the major design changes made in just a 6-year period. Note that each individual race in Age of Empires had a special racial bonus, and Ensemble liked to experiment with this too, adding civilizations whose infantry built buildings, started with extra town centers, or never needed to build houses. It's no surprise then that Ensemble rarely released balance patches, given that they were probably going to just change everything a few months later anyway. Just try to imagine playing competitively in an environment where virtually every single game mechanic could be profoundly changed in just a few months. If you're looking for an answer, it was either dreadful or awesome, depending on how you looked at it. The continuous, massive changes created an environment in which innovative players who could think well on their feet could constantly create new strategies and new styles of play. On the other hand, players who preferred to focus on mechanical execution often found themselves doing the exact same thing in every single game. Virtually every World Cyber Games in Age of Empires history was dominated by players doing the same strategy with the same race, the winner being decided purely on mechanical execution and map generator RNG. The top players who ended up sticking with the series after the transition to Age of Mythology tended to be people who liked to play lots of different races, preferring breadth of knowledge of the entire game rather than deep focus in one particular race. Nevertheless, this lack of stability in the game's mechanics was endearing in its own right. I can't help but miss the elegant balance Ensemble struck with each new release. They managed to keep just the right amount of familiar elements, the 4 H's for instance, to please longtime fans of the series, while still making huge changes. Every trailer they released inspired a feeling of, wow, That's going to be really cool. While I love the stability of StarCraft, I feel confident that any changes coming out of Blizzard will have virtually no impact on someone at my skill level. A little extra range for queens isn't going to change the equation for someone who regularly forgets to build their third base. Even the major economy and harassment changes in Legacy of the Void don't fundamentally change the way the game works, at least in comparison to the design changes we saw in the Age series. StarCraft II is going to continue to be StarCraft II, for better or for worse. Speaking of stability, I think now is a good time to talk about map randomization. Maps in Age of Empires are procedurally generated, a feature that stuck with the series through its lifetime. Ian Fisher, one of the lead designers of Age of Mythology, described the map generator in Age of Empires 1 in a 1997 interview. Roughly, the generator operates from a seed number, which provides it with its ability to be random. This number is used to plan the layout and composition of a map based on your preferences, i.e., if you select Highland, the algorithm favors land tile placement and retards water tile placement. The algorithm is set up in such a way that items are placed intelligently, that is, every starting position has a berry bush within X tiles, trees are placed in forests, etc. Having played every game in the series, I think this description could accurately describe any Age of Empires title, not just the original. If you're a StarCraft player, you can probably guess some of the surface level negative implications of this design. Procedural generation means maps will never truly be balanced because the layout of the map in any given game is unpredictable. It's not a coincidence that the most common maps played at a competitive level also tended to be the most consistently generated. From Arabia in Age of Empires 2 to Midgard and Savannah in Age of Mythology to Great Plains in Age of Empires 3, all tended to be open, expansive, and not have much of a water element, mitigating the impact of poorly placed resources. The different designs with regard to map generation result in different incentives for players. One is depth. StarCraft rewards deep knowledge of maps, and in response, mapmakers explicitly put together designs with certain gameplay interactions in mind. Even small details, like the distance from a mineral line to a spot across a canyon, have been meticulously implemented. This allows good players to study the intricacies of maps and make the most out of every game. Here's an example from a recent professional tournament of Euthermal, a Terran player, using this ravine to protect his tanks while sieging his opponent's third base. Procedurally generated maps reward thinking on your feet. Scouting is just as much about figuring out how to play the map as it is about figuring out what your opponent is doing. Top Age of Empires players certainly had strong mechanics, more so in Age of Empires 2, but creativity was also extremely important, with build orders shifting and changing on a per-game basis to accommodate the maps. For instance, a build on a procedurally generated map cannot depend on a precise timing to walk across the map, because that time depends on the canyons and rivers the generator has placed in front of you. What's probably more interesting from a design perspective is the effect on the metagame. Static maps encourage deep understanding, allowing players to create innovative new strategies specifically tailored for a specific map. Limiting players to a fixed map actually produces more creativity because players are incentivized to understand every nook and cranny and experiment with new ideas. This is counterintuitive. Back at the height of Age of Titans, a common complaint regarding the Frozen Throne from Age players was that its static maps made the game boring and less varied. Yet this is actually the opposite of what happens in practice. Procedural generation makes the depth required for creative, map-specific strategies virtually impossible. Aside from map generator quirks like the gold distribution on New England or the cliff placements on Alfheim, the random aspects of maps in Age of Empires mostly affected army positioning, not strategy on a game-to-game basis. There were lots of opportunities for innovation in Age of Empires, but the fact that maps were procedurally generated rather than static ended up not being a significant factor. As a result, players tended to focus mostly on the negatives, such as the bad luck of starting with poor resource distribution. I think it's a real shame that it worked out this way. There's something indescribably cool about competitive play on a randomly generated map. Every game is new and fresh. Each city that you build feels unique because it's built on top of a map layout that you know you'll never see again. It makes individual games more memorable. I definitely understand why static maps make for a more balanced competitive game, and I spent years experiencing bad RNG in competitive play. But there's a part of me that really misses the uniqueness and surprise factor of Age of Empires maps. The last thing I'll say on this topic is that I think the concept of procedurally generated maps is a good example of unintended consequences in game design, designed to introduce variety and promote creativity, but resulting in less depth and innovation in the end. I think the problem comes down to difficulty in implementation. Creating a random map generator that consistently produces balanced but varied maps every single time is incredibly difficult. Adding more variation increases the probability of generating a bad instance. Reducing variation takes away the advantages of procedural generation without bringing in the benefits of purely static maps. It's actually easier to painstakingly build maps by hand, either in-house or through community submissions, in order to produce better map variety, as surprising as that may be. I think maps are a good transition point into player mindset and what the designers were hoping to accomplish with these games. Blizzard has traditionally adopted an incremental approach, preferring to get things right and perfect them over time rather than move fast and break things. Blizzard's Mike Morhaime, in a 2008 interview, described the process in mechanical terms, picking a genre first before settling on higher-level items like franchise or setting. This is in stark contrast to the approach adopted by Sid Meier, the creator of the Civilization games, who preferred to first settle on an idea, like railroads, and then build a game around it, like Railroad Tycoon. I mentioned Sid Meier because Bruce Shelley, one of the original designers of Age of Empires, was also a project manager on the Civilization project. Mr. Shelley came from a board game background. The mechanics of board games are much more fixed than those of interactive computer games. The onus on the designer is to innovate on how those mechanics are used in order to produce a compelling experience. In interviews, Mr. Shelley describes his process as experimental and prototype-driven, playing around with lots of ideas in order to find something that works well. From these two perspectives, we can start to see the divergence between these two series, one focused on mechanical execution, refinement, and perfection, and one focused on bigger picture ideas and continuous experimentation. I think we can see the imprint of these philosophies in the actual mechanics of gameplay, as in, the mindset players are expected to adopt in order to be successful ends up aligning with the philosophy used to build the game. I think this is a fairly natural conclusion to draw. Players tend to go deep into highly stable, refined games, so the mechanics need to be complex and hard enough to enable that. Conversely, unstable, continuously changing games expect players to think on their feet, try things out, and be creative, placing less emphasis on pure technical execution. Macro management is a great example. Macro management, or macro for short, is building the stuff that you need, producing units and workers, building production buildings and new town centers, researching upgrades, etc. From Age of Empires II through Age of Empires III, macro management consistently became easier, reducing the total number of needed production buildings and the attention required to continuously build units. The same is true for the transition from StarCraft I to StarCraft II, but macro management in StarCraft II still retains an incredibly high skill ceiling. Even at the very highest professional levels of play, there are still noticeable differences in macro efficiency between players. Speaking personally, I didn't fully understand the concept of proper macro management until playing a lot of StarCraft, so I imagine a lot of other Age of Empires players, or even some average StarCraft players, have trouble with the concept too. To try to illustrate, I'll do a quick comparison between a game that I played at 4500 MMR on the North American server against Innovation, a professional Korean player competing in the Shoutcraft Kings tournament. 4500 MMR is Diamond Tier 1, better than average, but far from an expert. In both games, we go for roughly the same strategy, a stim timing attack against Zerg. At the 5-minute mark, Innovation is at 75 supply. I'm at 68, a 10% difference. At the 6-minute mark, Innovation is at 96 supply. I'm at 78, a 23% difference. At the 7-minute mark, Innovation is at 105 supply. I'm at 90. Bear in mind, by this point, Innovation has already fought the deciding battle of the game. In its absence, he'd be at roughly 120 supply, a 33% difference. Think about that for a second. The only thing I'm discussing here is producing units. Not upgrades, not building new production buildings, not controlling your army, not decision-making, not scouting, not expanding, not multitasking, just building units, while following the exact same build order. And the professional player is already substantially better than I am. This is the power of macro. Innovation doesn't need to be better at any of those other things I mentioned in order to beat me. He could probably just attack move across the map and win. If you're a veteran StarCraft player, you probably already know how this is possible, but I want to break it down for players who aren't familiar. I'll start with a comparison with Age of Empires III. Here's a game played between two top players, Nature Phoenix and Starsky. Over the course of a 16-minute game, the winner hit 18 army macro cycles, a cycle here defined as queuing up a unit in an idle production building. They built more total units than that, but buildings in Age of Empires III could build more than one unit at a time, so hitting a macro cycle just meant building a single one. You could add on more later while the first unit was still building, and they'd all come out at the same time. If you include home city shipments, the number of macro cycles jumps to 25, roughly 1.6 macro cycles a minute. Finally, they built about half a dozen production buildings. If we go back to Innovation's game and define macro the same way, he hit 51 army macro cycles in a 7-minute time span, roughly 7.3 macro cycles a minute. That's nearly 5 times more macro, and I haven't even included mules, upgrades, building new production buildings, or expanding, nor have I factored in the game's speed, which is 1.38 times faster. The sheer quantity of macro required in StarCraft II raises the macro skill ceiling so high that it turns it into a first-class skill that players are continuously improving, rather than something that every top player simply perfects. The deciding factor in this game of Age of Empires III was not the total amount of stuff that was built, which was roughly the same. We can see a clear divergence in design here. One game rewards excellent technical execution, whereas the other focuses more on bigger picture items. I want to emphasize here that I'm not saying Age of Empires III requires better strategy or decision making than StarCraft II. I'm simply making a relative valuation of these skill sets against the value of good mechanics within each game. Mechanics were simply relatively less important in Age. I looked at a number of games from this tournament involving several different civilizations and strategies, and the number of macro cycles per minute never even came close to StarCraft II. I mentioned earlier that macro management became progressively easier in each iteration of Age of Empires, so it's worth noting that Age of Empires II had a much higher macro skill ceiling. Units were built one at a time, and many more production buildings were needed. I don't think it should surprise anybody that this resulted in a much more dynamic and vibrant competitive scene. Players could more easily differentiate themselves, and playing a few percentage points better resulted in a few percentage points worth of a better army or economy. This is one of the reasons I'm consistently wary of Blizzard simplifying the macro mechanics in StarCraft II for the benefit of new players. I think this would be yet another example of unintended consequences in game design. Top players differentiate themselves in dozens of ways, some of which I mentioned above, like army control or multitasking. Simplifying macro probably wouldn't drastically affect professional play because there are so many other areas where the skill ceiling is unattainably high. New players tend not to even attempt these other skill sets. Eliminating macro as a skill differentiator would make the game frustrating for these folks, because macro is a highly proportionally rewarded skill. Getting X% better at it almost always results in an X% improvement in skill level. Other skills, like scouting, are more discrete in their rewards. The result for new players would be that getting better at the game wouldn't necessarily translate into better results, which would inevitably be very frustrating. From a design perspective, I think Age of Empires II and StarCraft II strike the right balance. A skill ceiling on macro that's unattainably high, proportionally rewarded, and with a low enough skill floor that anybody can do it decently. In fact, one thing I miss from Age of Empires II is its difficult economy macro, managing 100 villagers sprawled across half the map, spreading town centers, rebuilding lumber camps, seeding farms, and building a strong trade route. The higher skill ceiling and mechanical difficulty make it more interesting, not less, even for casual players like myself. Not only is it very rewarding to get better at, but it really makes me feel like I'm managing a full-fledged empire. Speaking of casual versus professional players, I think now's a good time to talk about balance. We've already discussed the difference in philosophy between these two series. One of the least appreciated features in StarCraft II is the way it achieves racial balance through proportional rewards. Because playing better is rewarded proportionally, even potentially imbalanced interactions can be overcome simply by playing a little bit better. Anytime I'm feeling salty, I can easily tell myself that someone like Innovation never would have lost that game. This is good motivation to keep playing and get better. The lower skill ceiling in the later Age games, specifically around macro management, made this a tougher sell. Good players always had roughly the same number of units, so imbalanced interactions were much more obvious. Balance is really interesting in StarCraft because of the tendency for players to pick one race and stick with it. This is a huge paradigm shift from the Age series, where the best players routinely mixed it up to get a broad range of practice, and then focused on the most imbalanced civilization for tournament purposes. StarCraft players end up investing a lot of time and resources into one specific race, and stick with it across design changes and balance updates. Players bring a lot more personal style to a race than in Age of Empires. In other words, the player chooses the playstyle and applies their race's unique features to accomplish it rather than the other way around. Probably the most satisfying aspect of StarCraft II's balance is that it's well balanced enough such that the outcome of any game is within a player's control. In other words, the outcome is based on the player's skill relative to their opponent, not the balance of the game. Real problems in racial balance only affect the very highest skill levels that most players will never reach. It's very frustrating to lose a game and feel uncertain whether the problem is a matter of game balance. For the vast majority of players, this is never the case in StarCraft. Through its community updates, support of community streamers, and collaboration with professional players, Blizzard does an excellent job convincing players to adopt an internal locus of control when it comes to their own play. Your destiny in StarCraft is your own choosing, not the balancing decisions by the development team. I think this discussion of balance is a pretty good segue into competitive multiplayer. The Age of Empires series historically had a fairly competitive multiplayer scene, although it progressively declined as time went on. A good way to look at this is by looking at the ELO ratings for the top players in the world, which increase or decrease alongside the size of the player base. Points get funneled upward as players enter the system, and taken away when players leave the system. The average top player in Age of Empires II had an ELO rating in the mid-2000s. This dropped to the 2400s in Age of Mythology, the low 2000s in Age of Titans, and eventually right around 2000 in Age of Empires III. Competitive one-on-one games are by far the most sensitive to changes in the size of the player base. Even small differences in skill between players will create lopsided results, meaning that it's critical to match players as closely as possible. The smaller the player base, the more difficult it is to do this, which leads to a vicious cycle. Fewer players means fewer quality games, which leads more players to quit and results in even fewer quality games. This goes on until the latter is effectively dead, and the only remaining players are setting up matches manually with people they already know are of similar skill. This was consistently the case in Age of Empires. Beyond the initial days of Age of Mythology, anyone of a decent skill level had to manually find an opponent in chat in order to get a game going. On the one hand, this was kind of nice. It nurtured a tight-knit community between the best players. It also led to high-quality practice. Players could ask each other to do specific builds and work on their ability to counter them. On the other hand, it was difficult to practice as much as desired because practicing was highly dependent on whether one of a small handful of other players was online and willing to play. There's something truly magical about logging into StarCraft II and being able to find a game at virtually any level of play on the ladder. It drastically reduces the entry cost into the game and allows players to stick with it even when friends take breaks. There's some irony here, given that the success of a ladder is dependent on lots of people playing on it, but a big player base actually makes it much easier to take breaks from the game. There's a strong social pressure in a small group of practice partners to be constantly available to ensure that everyone else can get practice time in, very similar to the pressure players in MMOs feel to raid alongside their guildmates. An active ladder provides a viable alternative that allows players to practice at their own pace and avoid feeling strongly tied to other people's schedules. This is especially important for a global community where players are often in completely different time zones. Speaking of a global community, the regionalization of StarCraft II stands in stark contrast to Ensemble Studios Online, ESO for short, which provided one global server. This unified the player base, but also introduced lag as a major issue. Due to differences in networking code, the lag in Age of Mythology and Age of Empires III depended on the connection between the two players. In comparison, in StarCraft II, each player's latency is dependent on their individual connection to Battle.net. If you could take an RTS player from the early 2000s and teleport them to today, probably the biggest shock would be how little lag there is. Advances in networking code, the internet backbone, and dedicated server support from Blizzard mean that playing online is astonishingly close to playing on LAN. I'm still constantly amazed that professional tournaments are played through Battle.net rather than a local connection. Granted, it's likely that there's some optimization made to prevent a round trip to the data center for computers on the same network, but the fact that a connection to Battle.net is made at all is still remarkable. One of the reasons for Battle.net's success is that Blizzard viewed it as a long-term investment and a platform for all its games. Greg Canessa, one of the leaders in Blizzard's online division, cited the development of online services as one of Blizzard's core competencies in a 2009 interview. Their long-standing willingness to take risks and push the envelope enabled them to reach the excellent matchmaking experience of today. If you're rolling your eyes at me, I want to clarify that I'm not referring to the user interface or usability of Battle.net. I'm focused on what's under the hood, like availability, the nuts and bolts of the networking code, the ability to reliably deliver updates, and so on. This stuff is really great, especially when compared to what came before it. Ensemble didn't much prioritize innovation in the online space. This makes sense given their history. Microsoft provided the zone for Age of Empires 1 and 2. Ensemble probably only built ESO because they were forced to by the closure of the zone. Age of Empires 3 didn't even feature an online ranking system at launch. It was added in later. The comparison of these two systems, Battle.net and ESO, showed the difference between a platform that a company is actively investing in and a checkbox that just needs to be checked in order to call a game complete. I want to emphasize that this is not a criticism of Ensemble. They focused on what they thought was important, and ESO just wasn't part of that. The things that they did prioritize showed the same level of craftsmanship and attention of Battle.net. For instance, the ease of developing scenarios in Age of Empires 2 and the accompanying book that was written alongside it sparked an interest that eventually became my career. That never would have happened with the albatross that is the StarCraft II editor. The last high-level concept I'll talk about is game speed. StarCraft II is a much faster game than any of the Age of Empires titles, mostly due to its accelerated game clock. A turbo mode was introduced in Age of Empires 2, but didn't see much use in competitive play. The game just wasn't designed for it. David Kim once suggested reducing the game speed for lower-level players in order to make the game easier. I'm probably beating a dead horse by this point, but in my view, this is yet another example of unintended consequences in game design. The speed of the game and the speed of the players playing it are unrelated. Good players will always go as fast as they can and try to do as much as possible. Casual players prefer to go at their own pace, yet with a fast game speed, they can still enjoy dynamic and exciting battles. Slowing it down wouldn't improve their play, since relatively speaking, everyone else would have more time too. It would just make the game less enjoyable. The thing to emphasize here is that casual players, more or less by definition, go at their own pace, not the pace that's optimal to play the game. The question to ask is, given a certain game speed, can a player with 20 or 30 actions per minute build a functioning economy and a large army? In other words, can they play the game at a basic level? This is definitely the case in StarCraft II, and hence why I think it would be a bad idea to slow things down for casual players. So far, we've covered a lot of high-level concepts, from core design philosophy all the way to game speed. Next time, I'll be diving into the lower-level mechanics of these games, like army control and resource gathering. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you next time.